Welcome to story time. I'm wrapping up what has been pretty much a month-long exploration of the similarities between yoga practice and this spring intention of gardening. And today I want to talk about the experience that I have with pruning or thinning. Now, that's a term that essentially means thinning the crop so that there's room for the flowers that remain or the fruit or the vegetables that remain in the soil, plenty of opportunity for their maturity and growth. So let's begin where we began, which was looking for inspiration from my teachers, from the sources that I go to. And this is namely from Thich Nhat Hanh's everyday peace cards. And so as I went through Thich Nhat Hanh's insights and inspirations, I pulled out a number of meditation intention cards from watering the right seeds and which seeds will we cultivate. In other words, what seeds are we going to plant? What are we going to pay attention to? And watering them, giving them our attention. Selective watering, watering those that need water, not necessarily watering those that don't need water. And more importantly, not failing to water or to nurture. And that often for me shows up in like counting on a relationship to continue in the way that I want it to, even if I don't invest in it, even if I don't give time, attention, and resources to it. So there's always analogies and correlations to my life and life itself, flowers and garbage, and that brought me to the idea of composting. But the idea that is truly the hardest for me has to do with this idea of letting go. Thich Nhat Hanh says, I don't need these things. And I have come to be able easily to prune my trees, to cut back branches when the tree grows too big. I'm thinking specifically of my butterfly bush and my lilac bush and some of the shrubs that are in the front corner that they hide the equipment, I guess it's the electrical lines and the cable line boxes that are in the front part of my lawn. And I really like not to see them. But I still want to be able to see in the time when this first came to be a practice, I wanted to see the bus stop so I could see when my kids got off at the corner, right? Or when they missed the bus in the morning. And if the shrubs got too big, I couldn't see them. And so that was a choice between my value of not having to always walk to the bus stop to retrieve the kids, but to be able to observe and to know that they were safe. In which case, trimming, pruning back the branches of the shrub was an easy choice. It's either that or it overgrew to the point where it was unruly and influencing negatively the primary objective of caretaking for my kids. But thinning is a skill and a necessary chore. And the hardest one, not just in gardening, but it's also hard in my dharma, in my life's work. So let me tell you what I mean by that. I love to put seeds in the ground, to cultivate, to plant seeds. And by that, I mean literally put marigold seeds and cover them up with soil. Plant little tiny baby dried out peas that, funnily enough, grow new pea crops, right? Last weekend, I actually had some onions that had started to sprout. So I planted onions in my container garden that would have otherwise gone to the garbage or to composting. So little things like that, I'm happy to do. But the problem is, for me, when those little seeds sprout and they take their shoots up through the soil, in my narrow knowledge, in my ignorance, I don't recognize them. And sometimes I weed the shit out of them, in which case none of them get to grow. It's easier to sweep the soil all the way than it is to navigate and to pick. But this is not unlike my regular life either, right? I dabble across the disciplines for integrating yoga in the asana, in the pranayama, in the meditation, in coaching and training, and in practice teaching. And in that, I can dabble and sprinkle. But I can't tell you how often I have a coach of my own, a trainer of my own, a mentor of my own who says, Kimberlyn, thin out your services, focus, and let one really grow and bloom. And there is true wisdom in that. Absolutely wisdom in that. And maybe that would make the most sense, not only in my life's work business, but in my life's work in my garden. And yet, there is a heartache that comes when I think of pulling out little plants that might just be the seed that I intentionally planted last month and now is finally strong enough to break free, to break through. So if I knew and had the confidence and competence to leave those that are the baby seeds of my planting versus those that are the baby seeds of wandering, right? So seeds from my maple tree wandering into my garden are probably the biggest nemesis. Or the first shoots of onion grass, or the first sprouts of a dandelion, which there are areas of my garden that I allow those things to grow. It's kind of a nod towards the idea that dandelions are not bad. I just don't want them here. So if I can redirect them, I've been known to transplant dandelions to another area of my yard rather than just pluck and kill them. And yet when I thin the seeds, I do it in such a focused way, an all or nothing way, that I actually end up undoing what I intentionally did with care and compassion maybe just a few weeks ago. So I don't know that I am at a place in my gardening to thin well. And so one of the ways in which I compensate for that lack of competency is I often buy starter plants that already have form and structure. So when I put them in the soil, I know what I'm looking for. I know what to leave in place, and anything that's around where I planted that can go away. Now, I have also tried marking the places where I've planted bulbs and rhizomes and seeds, but invariably they don't last, right? The stick or the sign that I put in the soil gets relocated by an animal or the weather, or I don't put it in far enough, in which case I forget and I no longer have access to that information. So I guess the good part of this story is that I've let go of needing to control all of that, and what grows I celebrate, and what doesn't, more often than not, my peace, my ease comes in I've forgotten, right? But in the moment when I'm looking at the seeds, sometimes I ask someone who knows more. And fortunately for me, one of my children knows a little bit more about these seed little sprouts, so I help identify which ones to keep and which ones to let go. But her attention span is about this big, so I can do maybe a square foot of soil with her guidance, and then practice that to cover all of the square footage of my garden. But how can I take this then into my yoga living practice? Well, it really is pausing to notice what is. This is the karma or the karmic stages of transparent alignment. I pause, and in that space, can I let it be? Literally looking at this seed, what happens if I were to let it be? Eventually, I'm going to be able to identify if it's what I wanted or what I didn't want. Unfortunately for me, sometimes I have to leave it long enough, in which case now it's got really firm roots. Maybe it's a deep rooted plant, or maybe it's a plant that actually has some toxicity or harm to the rest of my plants, in which case now I've enabled an ill-fitted element to my garden of living. So there is a balance of how soon do I intervene and how long do I let lie. So let it be, let it go is often recognizing that I don't have to have the answer right away. In other words, yes, no, and I don't know live in relationship to one another. I often use the analogy of the cervical spine, right? C1, cervical 1 helps us say yes. C2 and 3 helps us say no. See that, a 1-to-2 ratio? But C4, 5, 6, and 7, another 1-to-2 ratio is for I don't know. And I'm learning as a practitioner of yoga and a practitioner of life, I'm learning that it's okay not to know, that it's okay to come back later when I perhaps know more or just care differently. So while I have come to be able to prune the bushes, and I've been able to wait in the process of letting some seeds get a little bigger so that I can identify perhaps what they are, the area that is still the most difficult for me is when the seeds are too close together and I have to thin them in order to let others grow. In other words, when I put down the marigold seeds and 5 or 6 or 10 or 20 come up all cramped together, my experience of leaving them be, letting it be, has stifled all of their growth, in which case none of them survive. But how? How do I, as an observer, choose which ones to remove? And at this stage, the seeds are so little, they will not transplant. They simply die. They sacrifice in order to allow these to grow. Let me make an analogy and bear with me for a moment, because I'm not talking about letting people or letting somebody die as a levity, right? But in the same sense that when I opened my studio, when I designed the kind of space I wanted to create, I wanted everyone to have extra large mats, longer and wider than your traditional mat. I also wanted to reduce the number of students who were in the practice space so that there was plenty of room to accommodate our bodies and yet still allow everyone to be seen in their space. And that meant that I had to reduce the number of students in my class. And this shows up every single time a class gets to full. I fear about who didn't get in. Who am I leaving out? My heart breaks just a little bit. But then I have to remind myself that those who show up are those who can really dive in and expand in the fertile soil that I've created of Life's Work Yoga Studio, of where I can give my attention. And we can even go to science to confirm that our minds, our bodies, our hearts can only handle so many pieces of information at the same time. It is literally impossible for us to pay attention to 30 or 40 or 50 people. It's impossible really for us to pay attention to more than one fully. We can shift, right? But what I have learned by teaching large groups of 50 to 100 students is that when I teach to large groups, they become a group as opposed to individuals within the all of the group, the union of the group. And although there is an exhilaration there is it's a hunger driven often from our ego to have a big audience. I know that there's energy and there's power and there's healing and there's really good yoga there. But it's a different nuance, right? Having a cluttered garden, they call it perhaps a cottage garden, right? can feel great on one level, but on another level, we've missed the depth, the strength that is possible when we thin to just enough that can be supported and nurtured and fed and cherished for their unique contribution. So I had a student just ask me last week, why didn't you choose a bigger space so that you could have more students? You're such a strong teacher. More students need to study with you. Well, why didn't I choose a bigger garden? Because I don't have any more time to manage more plants in my garden. And if I did take on more students, more clients, it means the energy of taking care of myself might suffer, or the energy that I have to give you would be diminished just a little bit, because just like space, just like oxygen, there is a controlled quantity, a universal balance. I can't make energy. By my mind and my body and the choices that I make, I can direct the flow of energy or give my attention. And by giving my attention to what matters most, and by thinning who I give my attention to, I can help them to flourish, to root deeply in the soil that is a safe and calm abiding space of the practice. And then reach out and expand. Maybe they don't study with me for very long. They don't practice with me for decades, because they move on to someone who can help them with that next layer of growth. Not unlike when I had to transplant a mulberry tree that had randomly grown, meaning it was planted there probably by the local wildlife, but it was too close to my house. It was going to cause damage to my foundation. So I transplanted it to a place in my yard that had plenty of room for its branches and its roots to safely coexist with my house and the way in which we use the space. And sometimes we as humans also need to transplant ourselves into a new community. And so the lesson here is not that we don't want to grow and expand, it's that we've got to sometimes thin and prune and then nurture so that we're aligning with our core values and allowing that to reap the fruit that we have the energy to blossom forth. I've got some deadheading to do. That's when you clip the flowers that have passed off, so that that energy is redirected to the roots. And that happens in our relationships too. We cut off those relationships that are done blooming, that are done growing and nurturing both sides of the relationship. It's not an easy thing to do. For me, I've practiced that more than I have thinning here when there's all these fresh little sprouts. But where is it in your practice perhaps the most challenging? Is it cutting the branches, severing a relationship? Is it perhaps pruning or supporting or guiding relationships into the way in which you want them to grow? Maybe it is planting the seeds, the discipline, the practice of choosing wisely what we give our attention to. And maybe if you've scattered the seeds, now it's time, like it is for me, perhaps, to thin, to concentrate. So in light of that, the summer schedule begins in May. And there are some things that are shifted on the offerings here at Life's Work Yoga, the expansion of some new teachers, the shifting of some classes, and the times in which we can come together so that hopefully we can find that fertile soil to connect and to continue growing and studying and living yoga, as long as it is that we serve and nurture each other. Thanks for being here with me and let me share a little perspective of the garden and how the garden is you and me and growing and learning and living yoga well. And you breathe deeply and move freely, even if that means you need to be transplanted. Right? so that you can labor lovingly and live vibrantly. Take care of you. Take care of those around you by committing to what matters most and doing the work of doing and not doing and undoing and redoing, so that every time you show up to your fullest capacity to share joy, love, your Dharma. Namaste. Comments, questions, thoughts, or suggestions?
Have you really transplanted dandelions? Holy cow.
I love it. That's great.
Right now, the process is transplanting. They're a kind of violet, right? My mom used to call them Johnny Jump Ups, and they're just this kind of a roundy green leaf that have purplish and white. I think it's 3 or 4 petals. I love them, but every time my son mows the lawn, he mows off the flowers. So the roots are fine and the greens are fine, but I hate to see them mowed down. So every time I have a few minutes, I go out and these are a local weed for many, but I harvest them from the grass part of my garden and I move them to the containers or to the flower beds of my garden. So yes, I've moved dandelions. Yes, I've moved these Johnny Jump Up violets. Yes, I've moved goldenrod trees. Yeah. And then I've also thrown them away.
Well, that's just a little crazy, but
I know.
it's also awesome.
It's funny though, in the sense that it comes back to that idea of what am I choosing and what am I practicing? Do I always have a successful transplant? No. But by making the effort of transplanting, kind of like the effort of taking a spider outside, it lessens the burden of my heart a little bit, until I learn something like how spiders can't live outside. They don't acclimate to an outside world. So when I was taught that just this last week, I realized how many spiders I've killed by the nature of their transplanting. Well, that wasn't my intention, and it is the consequence. And so now I watched a spider on the ceiling for about 10 minutes just to see if I could be with it. And then I let it go, meaning I let it be where it was and I let go of my attention on it. It's still in the house. And I hadn't thought about it until just now. And that was at least 3 or 4 days ago. Is that the way? I don't know. Doesn't have to be, but it was the way in the moment. And I think it served me. So for me, that's the practice. Let it be, let it go, until I can let it flow and just essentially coexist without friction until it comes around again.